Stan, you're up. Go ahead.
Great. Well, happy to be here as always. I think this is my third time with you guys.
Yes.
You guys are like my favorite lunch.
Of course. By the way, congratulations, you are now a 3-time loser.
Thank you. But then I do go to some pretty boring lunches. Well, you know, I'm the DA, as you guys know, and Ralph asked me, obviously law enforcement intersects with issues that libertarians care about in a number of respects. I've been here to talk, I think, kind of generally about my philosophy of the office. And then last time I brought my chief of sex assaults, and we talked about sex assault prosecution, which is, I think, a very interesting issue. And Ralph asked me to come and talk today about a couple of things. The lead issue is how the legalization of marijuana, or as I think the email put it, the semi-legalization of marijuana has impacted my office in law enforcement in Boulder County, which I'm happy to talk about. First of all, semi-legalization, I think, refers to the fact that marijuana remains illegal on the federal level. As a matter of fact, not just illegal, but really, really illegal. Marijuana remains a Class 1 controlled substance, and for those of you, I can't remember how many lawyers are here, but for those of you that know much about federal drug law, a Schedule 1 controlled substance under the federal system is the most serious type of controlled substance, and it means that the federal government has made a determination that the substance involved is not only illegal, but that it has no accepted medical use. To just talk about this for a minute, and then I'll talk about Colorado. This reality has created a number of problems, the most significant of which is that there's no federal money available to do studies on marijuana intoxication because the federal government has continued to have marijuana listed as a Schedule 1 substance. That has created a lot of problems for those of us who live in states like Colorado where marijuana is legal because we don't have the body of science that we have with alcohol and actually with a number of other intoxicants because there hasn't been the federal money available to do the studies. The issue of what the impact has been locally of legalization of marijuana, I think it's fair to say that my opinion is that the impact of legalization in Boulder County and in Colorado as a whole has overall been positive. As a matter of fact, I think you can. I don't think any law enforcement person will tell you that the complete criminalization of marijuana was not effective, was very expensive, led to a lot of injustice, and that the legalization that Colorado and other states have attempted has worked pretty well. One of the reasons it's worked pretty well is that legalization of marijuana is sort of set up in Colorado to mirror the legalization of alcohol after Prohibition through, I think it was the 21st Amendment that re-legalized, that permitted states to legalize.
Repeal Prohibition.
Yeah, repeal Prohibition. The key, for those of you that know the history of the early 20th century, Prohibition came about through a combination of the growing political power from the Christian right in the early 20th century and the growing political power of the progressive movement that eventually got an income tax in place. The reason Prohibition was never approved in the 19th century was because most of the tax revenue that the federal government obtained came from the sale of things, including the sale of liquor. So until you got an income tax in place, the federal government was not going to prohibit the sale of liquor because there was no way to fund it. Once they got the income tax in place, the combination of kind of the growing religious movement in the 20th century, the growing family rights and women's protection movement, and the progressive movement from the left came together and Prohibition was passed. Prohibition didn't work very well, but it was repealed through a constitutional scheme that was acceptable by giving local control to the states in terms of heavy licensing and regulation of alcohol. The state legislature in Colorado has pretty much done the same thing with marijuana. Every individual city and county has the right either to ban the sale of marijuana entirely, which a few have done, not many in Boulder County, or to regulate it very, very heavily. The city of Boulder has probably the most aggressive regulations of marijuana of any city in Colorado. Their regulations, I think, have worked pretty well. If you want to get a feel for how the regulations work compared to other cities, drive down South Broadway in Denver, which is kind of the marijuana marketing sector of Denver, and then drive around Boulder and compare the different marketing that you have for marijuana in Boulder as compared to Denver. Boulder has a very discreet marketing system. You can drive around Boulder as a tourist or somebody that doesn't know the community very well and not realize for a long time that there's marijuana stores all over the place. But in Denver, because the regulation is less restrictive, the marijuana advertising tends to be much more kind of in your face and garish. From a criminal perspective, the major, we were not prosecuting a lot of marijuana cases in Boulder prior to legalization anyway, but marijuana was used quite frequently as a basis for probable cause during the course of an investigation. And as everybody probably knows, but I'll quickly restate it, under the Fourth Amendment, to be able to search a vehicle or search a home or make an arrest, a law enforcement person has to have probable cause, which is a reasonable basis to believe that a crime is being committed. In the pre-legalization era in Colorado, the odor of marijuana was a very frequent basis for probable cause to conduct searches of cars or homes or to make arrests. Because if you walked up to a car of teenagers and you weren't quite sure what was going on here, but you smelled marijuana, and marijuana is illegal, most of the time you have probable cause to maybe arrest somebody in the car and to do a search. Without that legal basis, that has changed police tactics significantly. We've had to retrain police on how to react to probable cause and how to handle searches. It hasn't had any kind of deleterious effect, in my opinion. And it's actually, I think, made cops better cops, because relying on the odor of marijuana as a probable cause to search things is a fairly lazy police tactic. We prosecute very, very few marijuana-related cases in my office. The only ones we prosecute I compare to what I would call white-collar crime prosecution, which is to say, in the state of Colorado and in Boulder County, a person has a right to engage in all kinds of businesses, but if you don't comply with the law in doing it, you may be committing a crime, and if you are, we will prosecute that. So an example is selling of mortgages or selling of securities, that kind of thing. Heavily regulated area. It's legal if you do it right. If you don't do it right, it's criminal and we'll prosecute you. That's sort of the way we approach marijuana. If one is complying with the statutes for marijuana growing and sale and use in Colorado, we'll not go anywhere near that. If one is trying to kind of go outside the marijuana statutory scheme to either avoid taxes or to engage in some kind of illegal activity, we will prosecute that. We don't have many of those cases. We spend very little time, actually, thank you very much, on marijuana-related cases. Wow, is this on the camera? But we do occasionally have a case. The biggest impact from a public safety perspective of the legalization of marijuana is we've seen a real increase in impaired driving. We have about 3,200 DUIs a year in Boulder County. Of those currently, my staff estimates, and I checked this yesterday in anticipation of this talk, my staff estimates about between 35 and 45% of those cases involve either marijuana intoxication or marijuana combined with alcohol intoxication. We've had a number of vehicular fatalities recently that have involved marijuana, and I am concerned about the fact that the increased presence of marijuana in the community due to the legalization has made people more careless about the intoxicative effects of marijuana and has resulted in some dangerous driving. Other than that, I think the benefit or the impact on law enforcement in Boulder County has been either neutral or benefit, because we don't waste time on marijuana cases. As you may have read in the Denver Post, I think it was yesterday, Denver Post had a front page above the fold article about how the marijuana, this is a pretty amazing statistic. Marijuana sales in the state of Colorado are now 1/2 what the sales of oil and gas are. So when you think about that for a minute, about the economic impact of legalizing marijuana, which is not a law enforcement concern, the economic impact has been huge, and by and large has been beneficial. There's some continuing things I think we need to tweak. Many people find the public consumption of marijuana offensive, just like they find the public consumption of cigarettes offensive. People don't like going to the park or to the library or whatever with their kids and walking by people that are smoking marijuana. It is illegal to consume marijuana publicly. We don't seem to do a great job of enforcing those statutes. I think we got to get a better handle on that. And then the other issue that comes up is what people call marijuana tourism. Marijuana tourism, where people come, it's hard to know. There's various estimates of how many people come to Colorado simply because marijuana is legalized. But the reality is, if you do come here, whether because it's legalized or while you're here you decide to buy some, it's difficult to know. I mean, I think we got to sort out issues like, can you smoke it in your hotel room? Can you use it? Where can you use it? Because unless we have public consumption areas for marijuana that are appropriate and legalized, you're going to end up with people sneaking around and doing it illegally. So that's my basic take on marijuana. I think it's been a successful experiment. It's been an interesting legal experiment, an interesting experiment in federalism under the American system. And I think you're going to continue to see more and more states legalizing marijuana, and eventually the federal government will delist it and eventually decriminalize it. Whether they will actually legalize it in my lifetime, I don't know. The politics are much different. Although I will tell you that every spring I'm on the board of directors of the National DA's Association. Every spring I go to Washington, D.C. and lobby on various issues, and I often meet with Congress people from the South, much more conservative culturally than Boulder County. Doesn't take much to be more conservative than Boulder County, but they definitely are. And pretty much everybody I talk to anticipates marijuana will eventually be legalized everywhere, in every state, in every community, and eventually federally as well. So that's my overview. I can talk more if you want, or I'm happy to take questions on that topic or other topics.
So there's going to be some administration here. If you wish to speak, please turn on the microphone, or in fact, turn on the microphone right now. There's a little button at the top. Turn it orange. And then raise your hand. And so we have Mark. Pardon? I'm sorry. Go ahead first, and then Scott will be next, and then you'll be next. And talk into the mic real close to your mouth.
This close? Or a little farther?
Yeah, that's perfect.
My question is, has the legalization of marijuana, have you seen a decrease in the amounts of minor in possession here in Colorado, or has that pretty much stayed the same?
Yeah, it's a great question. The question is whether it's impacted. Essentially, you're asking whether it's impacted the rates in which juveniles are using marijuana,
Or the rates in which law enforcement has been writing citations and tickets for the juvenile use of marijuana. I would suspect it's probably stayed the same, if not gotten higher.
Yeah, it has stayed about the same. That's a really good question. I was on the governor's school safety task force, and every year we did a very comprehensive survey of adolescent use of marijuana, and the legalization does not appear to have increased it at all. Some studies actually show it's decreased somewhat. The one impact that's significant is that the marijuana we're seeing now is much stronger than previously, and that is, I think, a public safety concern, and that people are sometimes surprised how potent the marijuana they're having is. But many of the people that were against legalization used their primary reason as being the impact on youth, and it would become much more prevalent. That doesn't seem to have happened.
Scott, and please speak right into the microphone.
I'm wondering what your opinion is. You don't necessarily have to have a position, but opinion is on the medical use of marijuana. As a physician and interested in science in general, I feel that medicinal marijuana is much like additional line. It's more or less an excuse to try to get around the prohibition. And if marijuana actually has medical uses, they should be separated out, identified, and tested like any other medication or chemical. But I'm wondering what your thought is on that.
Yeah, my opinion is very similar to yours, which is that, I'm certainly no doctor. I have no scientific background. I've heard anecdotally enough stories about marijuana helping with various issues that it wouldn't surprise me if there are legitimate medical uses for marijuana. However, the current scheme we have is very similar to the structure they had under Prohibition. And again, Prohibition is such a fascinating period of time in our history. But one of the exclusions for complete prohibition of alcohol was medical use. And in the 20s and 30s, people got very good at going and getting a prescription for 2 or 3 scotches every night to deal with back pain. Very much the kind of thing we saw when you had the medical marijuana scheme entirely. So I think, again, that's another, that dovetails back to the problem with it being a Schedule I substance. There needs to be the kind of rigorous peer-reviewed testing to determine whether or not there is medical use that's legitimate, and I don't think we have that right now.
Pass the microphone down, please.
I have 2 questions.
Sure.
I'm hoping I won't take too much of the time, but so it seems to me, in the face of science, the federal government having classified marijuana on the same level as methamphetamines and cocaine and whatnot,
And heroin.
and heroin and things that we can all kind of on the surface level see are not really have no business being associated with each other. I wonder, do you see any sort of alternative motivation behind the federal government being so? And Obama just recently, within the last 4 years, reasserted that yes, marijuana will remain a Schedule I substance. Do you see any alternative motivation behind that? I can't see any sort of logical reason behind it. I have to imagine there's some alternative motivation.
Well, it's a really fair question. I was quite surprised that the Obama administration did not at least move to a Schedule II, which would have permitted much broader testing. I am not at all a conspiracy theory kind of guy. I've been involved in government long enough to know that it's hard enough to get government to do anything, much less participate in a conspiracy. But lots of people are. What I do know is there's an enormous amount of inertia behind the federal enforcement of drugs generally. We have huge agencies. The DEA is a huge agency. Something like 35% of its budget is designated to be for marijuana enforcement. So one of the realities that's happens in the world of Washington is that those agencies have a lot of lobbying clout, and they have a lot of, and they all are great. And this probably would resonate with a libertarian audience. Government bureaucracy is great at perpetuating itself, and DEA has definitely seen the broader legalization of marijuana as a threat to its budget and to its existence. So how that play, but that's about as far as I can go. I can tell you when I go to the National DAs Association group, which is a group of state elected DAs like me, it doesn't make a lot of sense to us. We've met with federal officials. There's a lot of DAs think that marijuana should be illegal and are very strong about it. But how the federal government gets to their conclusion that they've actually concluded that it has less medical use than cocaine has. And how you get there is hard to know. Now, it's not just, I think we have to be careful about not jumping to the conclusion that every anecdotal story you hear about somebody with cancer smoking marijuana and feeling better necessarily means it's a medical use. But, I think it's been very difficult, and I think an entity like the Obama administration has to choose its battles. I think they fought the bureaucracy battle as hard as they could, and they eventually came out with a somewhat watered-down thing. But I don't know that I can take it much farther than that.
We have Mike, Brian, and then Bill, and then we have several other.
I have some questions too. Whenever
Okay. What's your name? Pardon?
Brandon.
Brandon. And Brandon, if you won't, DA Garnett, if you don't mind, Brandon will be the last question on this issue.
Okay.
We have other things.
That's
Brian,
fine,
did I
of
miss you?
Oh, no.
You
No,
were
so it's
on the list.
Mike, and then Brian, and then who else was there? There was Brandon and Bill. Bill and then Brandon. Go ahead, Mike.
Stan, first is a minor question. If you could expand a little bit more about the whole diving while impaired issue, because the science on that is far from settled, what your experience is. But the bigger issue is one of the arguments against legalization is, but the crime will go through the roof kind of thing. What has been your actual experience about what legalization has done to the whole crime landscape?
Let me answer the second question first because it's easier. Legalization, I mean, yeah, people in law enforcement are great at slippery slope arguments, which are, slippery slope is a classic kind of false argument in a debate where you say, well, that may sound meritorious, but if you do it, it will lead to horrible, horrible things. That is not panned out with marijuana. We have not seen, in one of the strongest arguments against legalization was it will increase other crimes, robbery, homicide, and other crimes, either due to intoxication or to the fact that marijuana businesses are now buying and selling lots of amount of marijuana in with cash. The reality is everywhere in Colorado, it has had no impact on crime rates. We've had a couple of cases of robberies of marijuana stores, but we get tons of. I mean, most landlords I know. I don't know if some of you guys may be landlords. Most commercial landlords I know would rather have a marijuana store in their shopping center than a liquor store or a pawn shop or a check cashing business. The owners of marijuana stores tend to be very buttoned down folks. They really want to prove to the world that they can be legitimate, and we haven't seen much ancillary crime, and that's been really gratifying. You're not seeing crime rates generally are kind of down everywhere. The legalization of marijuana has not had a huge impact. The impairment and driving issue is really tricky because when I first started prosecuting as a deputy district attorney in 1982, the science relating to alcohol intoxication was not nearly what it is now. We had higher rates of alcohol and whatever that were permitted. We now have such excellent studies with regard to blood alcohol level and the effect of intoxication on perception and delay reaction, whatever, that we can be very confident and very precise, and our juries are very accepting of the science that's presented in that. We don't have that with marijuana. What we have is we have a lot of anecdotal impressions of a couple of things. One is that there seems to be a magnifying effect of marijuana and alcohol, where people can be under the presumed limit for marijuana of 5 active nanograms of THC and under the presumed limit of 0.05 blood alcohol, but somehow together that appears to be intoxicating. And that's where we need the science to help us with that. Because currently my deputies are left with the challenge of prosecuting these cases the way we prosecuted DUI in the 30s, which is you'd have a cop say, well, he smelled of alcohol, he'd been to a bar, and his eyes were bloodshot and runny, and he had a little bit of trouble with the roadsides. That's all they had in those days. That's kind of what we have now. So it's a concern, but I will tell you, we see a lot of cases where marijuana impairment appears to us to have contributed to the accident. One of the things I'm talking about doing is working with the marijuana industry to help to begin a public awareness campaign on this issue, to just make people aware that, look, it's legal, you can use it, but be aware of intoxication.
Mike, is your next question short, because I really do want to move through it. Brian is next. And Brian, you don't need the microphone.
Okay, a couple of quick comments on, one is on the juvenile issue. I suspect that probably what they expected was that the legal users would not hand stuff down to juveniles.
Right.
But I would guess that maybe what's happening is that before you had a for-profit black market.
That's right.
That was huge.
That's exactly right.
And that many of them were selling to juveniles, and now without the huge market, there are a few of them trying to push to juveniles.
That's exactly right. And you know what else is happening is the black market is very hard for law enforcement because we're not quite sure who it is, where they're selling, whatever. And when the kids are sneaking out behind the high school down along the creek buying from some dude, that's much harder to control than it is to control a store. The other thing that we're seeing with a lot of cases, and you can debate whether this is good or bad, is a lot of the juvenile use, kids are getting it from their parents. Just like, in the old days, breaking in your dad's liquor cabinet. So.
The major question I had, though, was what are your thoughts on drug legalization in general of other drugs, and what you think the climate is among law enforcement for seeing that happen ever?
It's a really good question. I'm much more hesitant with other drugs. Other drugs, cocaine, methamphetamine, and heroin in particular, do have such a debilitative effect that I'm not comfortable saying they should be legalized. But I will tell you that I hosted a group of 12 elected DAs back in July from big cities across the country, and 4 of them, including the DA from San Francisco, who's a very good DA, very tough on crime, but he's arguing in favor of legalization of almost everything combined with very heavy regulation. So I think there's an increased appetite for that debate in law enforcement, but I think mainly people are taking a wait and see attitude, just kind of see how the marijuana thing plays out. And with stuff like meth and heroin and cocaine, because the mere use of those things, and methamphetamine is a classic example, the mere use of it can be so debilitative and so immediate that it's very difficult for people in law enforcement to talk about legalization.
Bill, microphone right next to your mouth. Thank you.
Thanks. I guess it's 3 parts, because I read somewhere that the overall number of fatal crashes have gone down in Colorado significantly since marijuana legalization. So while it may be contributing to some, I think it's a lot of people like to stay home when they start smoking. I actually had 2 others. I was working on my ballot, and I noticed you were the only candidate, and there's a term limit thing. So if the term limit doesn't get through, what will you do next?
That's a great question. I actually am currently, and I think Ralph wanted me to talk about term limits eventually, which I'm happy to do. I'm running for my 3rd term, and the term limit thing would actually give me a chance to run for a 4th. So I'll be DA for another 4 years, regardless of what happens. After that, when I'm done being DA, whenever that is, I just love practicing law. I love being a lawyer. I'm sure I'll go practice law someplace. Yeah.
Brandon.
So I also have I guess a multi-part question, but they're sort of related. It goes back to the OWI issue. So you said that you've noticed an increase in marijuana-related OWI. At the same time, have you seen any, going back to the self-medication question from earlier, have you seen any sort of concurrent maybe decrease in people who are on oxy OWI,
Yeah.
alcohol OWI?
We haven't, but I don't think there's a causal connection between the two, because I think at the same time that we're seeing marijuana being legalized and used increasingly, we're also seeing an opioid crisis that's developing tied to a number of things, including occasionally over-medication by doctors of pain and other things. So we haven't seen that. Wouldn't surprise me if eventually we did. I do think, again, I'm no doctor and I don't pretend to be using stating a medical opinion, but I do think one of the arguments in favor of using marijuana for medical uses, such as pain management, is that it does appear to be less addictive than opioids.
And then the other part of it was sort of the statistical analysis, I guess. So do you think that the increase in OWI, marijuana-related OWI, has anything to do with maybe a lack of stigma on the use of marijuana? People will admit it more freely. It's being tested more regularly by enforcement agencies. And do you think that the increase in marijuana-related OWI has outpaced the growth in alcohol OWI or other drug OWI, or is it kind of all going?
Those are great questions. First of all, we're not really seeing an overall increase in the number of DUI cases we have in Boulder County. What we're seeing is an increased percentage of those in which marijuana is a factor. That's a good thing, I think. In other words, that we're not seeing more impaired driving. I do think one of the realities is that because marijuana was initially legalized through the medical, in Colorado it was legalized medically in 2000, in Amendment 21, I think it was called. And And so until it was legalized recreationally for almost 15 years, people had to use
mean
marijuana.
medically?
Pardon me?
Didn't you mean medically, since it was?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Since it was legalized, yeah, what I'm trying to say is it was legalized medically first, and it was used that way for quite a while until it was legalized recreationally. People got very accustomed to articulating, some would say fabricating, a medical reason to use marijuana. I mean, the joke was, isn't it amazing that all the medical marijuana licenses go to 23-year-old, guys that snowboard all the time? And so I think what that did, I think, is reduce the stigma. Not that I want there to be a lot of stigma about the use of marijuana, but I do want there to be awareness that it's also an intoxicant. And so, in other words, and this is where one of the challenges for us is to figure out at what level can you have a certain amount of THC in your system for medical or other use and not be so impaired that you can't be driving. And that's hard for us to figure out right now.
I guess my question was, do you think that, well, with the way that it's looked at now, do you think that there are more people using marijuana and driving, or do you think there's a similar number of people doing it, they're just more willing to admit it now, and that's kind of skewed the sample?
I don't think they're more willing. I don't think it's admitting. I think it's more use. That's my impression, but I'm not certain, and that's not a statistically based opinion.
Okay, we have 3 more topics to cover. Brian is suggesting that we stay on marijuana for a little bit longer, but the 3 other topics are something that each one of us has received on our ballot, except for those outside of Boulder County. The ballot selfie law and the term limits for the DA, which DA Garnett has already touched on. I suggest that we address the Hillary Hall issue first. Brian, if you want to jump in, I know if you don't want to, I can do it.
Well, I can start.
Speak loudly, Brian.
Well, I guess so. Our issue is on sending political comments with the mail ballot, and for instance, it's you're only supposed to include election-related materials with the mail ballot. That's what the statute says. So, would you be concerned what would you do if a county clerk sent a Trump brochure in with the mail ballots? I assume you'd consider that to be illegal, right?
Yeah, there would be statutes that would prevent that.
Yeah, and would you consider any sort of editorial comment about candidates or whatever to be illegal?
I would, yeah.
Now, many candidates fear the notion of an October surprise. Mm-hmm. So doesn't it make sense that somebody who wishes to support a candidate might, if they fear an October surprise, might tell people to vote early as an editorial comment to try to support that candidate?
Yeah, and I hadn't thought about this till I got the email from Ralph on the issue. Let me put in context what Hillary's doing. I know Hillary pretty well. We work a lot on a number of issues. Boulder County, for some of you that have been here a while, probably remember that in the late 90s and early 2000s, we had a number of problems with getting our darn ballots actually counted. As a matter of fact, that resulted in the recall of a county clerk and recorder named Linda Salas in, I think, 2002, because it took like 6 days to get everything counted. So the county clerk feels a lot of pressure to just have the mechanics of the election work well. One of the best ways to help with that from her point of view is for people to get their ballots right back in so that they can get them all processed and announced. As you probably noticed, these days, election night, there's like no drama. They just announce what the numbers are. So that's what she's trying to do. I hadn't thought of it, and I would have never said anything about that to her until you guys mentioned it. It's a fair point that you shouldn't be doing anything. I mean, I don't see it as clear as putting a Trump or Clinton brochure in the thing, and I don't see it as prosecutable. But I can see the argument that the county clerk and government should not do anything to interfere with the deliberative process of the election. And if people want to wait until 5:59 on the night of the election to turn in their ballot, that should be fine. They shouldn't be told not to do that. Partly because you may want to wait and see how many more emails of Hillary Clinton's come out, or how many more women want to claim that they were groped by Donald Trump to make your decision. So that's a fair point.
Yeah, in fact, we suggest that it's ideal to suggest people wait until the last minute because more information could come out. That we think it's negative for a democracy to encourage people to vote early.
That's an interesting thought, and I'll talk with Hillary about that.
Yeah, and we'd also say that government, the claim that she's not competent to count the votes, or she's concerned that she's not going to be competent to count the votes quickly, shouldn't impact whether or not you allow a political statement on the ballot. That shouldn't be an excuse.
That's true, although I will tell you that Boulder County, there was a period of time when a Republican Secretary of State was very much trying to undermine the confidence the voters would have in votes out of Boulder County. So, I mean, I understand Hillary's concern about her job. It's like when I go to trial, we don't gauge my office or me by whether we win our cases. We gauge by, do we present an appropriate case? Are we there on time? Do we have our witnesses ready to go, et cetera? It's a basic competence issue. That's where I feel the pressure, and I know she feels it too, but it's a fair point about not encouraging people to vote early.
Yeah, and it's...
In terms of, do you mind if I jump in, Brian?
Okay.
In terms of elections and the process, one of the things I worry about for any county clerk, whether honest or not, is that it is very easy to set up a system of volunteers who are opening the ballots to gauge which way, at least in that particular county, the vote is going. And that information is valuable to county chairs so that they know whether or not to put in more resources into this county or that county. It's one of the reasons that I recommend that people wait to the last moment. Besides getting all the information, it's you don't want to give that kind of information out to county clerks or to their surrogates or to their employees, because it can skew an election. And I don't like elections being skewed. Does anybody else have a comment about elections? Brian?
Well, I just wanted to follow up to say, obviously it seems as though it might have less of an impact than including a Trump brochure, but why is it not prosecutable? It's a political statement. It shouldn't matter whether you agree with that political statement or have more sympathy for that than for, say, a Trump brochure. It shouldn't matter.
To turn in your ballot early? The turning in the ballot early issue?
Having that in the mail.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't thought about it. I haven't done the analysis. It's hard for me. I mean, I can understand why we should encourage people not to be encouraging people to vote early. But from a prosecution perspective under the statute, that's a whole different thing from saying, make sure you vote no on Proposition 71.
It's still an attempt to influence the election.
Yeah, I think it'd be hard. I don't think there's many DAs that would agree with that. But I hear what you're saying. I think it's a fair point. I'm just not going to prosecute it.
So, especially in this election, where, as you say, you've got WikiLeaks coming out and Trump things, so it could definitely have an impact on the election.
It could. I mean, I think it's an interesting issue, and you probably should do a whole lunch on WikiLeaks at some point. I think what WikiLeaks is doing is making everybody kind of ho-hum about email releases. But anyway.
Okay, we have a couple of other things. Let me get to the. I'm sorry. Do you have anybody else have a question about this issue of putting it what Brian and I consider an editorial comment about how to vote? Go ahead.
No,
And speak up, and we need the microphone.
no, it's just hard to hear back here.
Okay, then we'll.
Everybody does speak up a little
I can
bit
stand.
plus.
Well, I guess I
There's
don't.
a chair right here if you want to sit at the table.
Yeah, we have a chair right here.
Water.
This is like the best place right now. Right?
Okay.
Quick
Go
comment,
ahead.
yes on WikiLeaks. Love to hear more about that.
Well, I think the whole WikiLeaks thing is very interesting because I think.
Can I stop you for one?
Oh, yeah,
Would
sure.
you like to do a whole session on WikiLeaks?
Yeah, I don't claim to be an expert on WikiLeaks. I've just got given. Yeah, I could do that. I could.
Okay, so
Yeah.
let's hold off on that so that we can get the charming DA Garnett back. I mean, I have to find a reason.
Of course.
Okay, other than getting myself arrested. Okay, we have the ballot selfie law.
Oh yeah. Well, Colorado has 22 district attorneys, and I know them all, and they're all characters. District attorneys tend to be pretty good politicians. and they tend to reflect the communities that they come from. The current district attorney in Denver is a guy named Mitch Morrissey. He's a Democrat like me. He's a very unpredictable guy. And some of us will not mind eventually seeing in January a new district attorney there because he can be unpredictable. For some reason, he got all worked up about ballot selfies, which I don't know any other district attorney that cares about this. The issue is we have a whole bunch of very arcane laws about elections, which we could do. Hillary and I could do a whole thing on that sometime. You guys would probably find that interesting. Because what's happened with election law is ever since statehood in the 1870s, the legislature's been tinkering with these statutes, and you've added on all kinds of nonsense through the years. Somewhere in there was a statute passed that said that it's illegal to show your ballot to somebody else. And the idea is, you don't want to be showing, me showing Ralph, here's how to vote, buddy, here's what I did, is using it as a way to kind of undercut the secret ballot requirement. So it does make it a crime to, let's say you guys decided the Boulder lunchtime libertarians are all going to vote yes on 106. And to make sure everybody knows that, we're going to send Ralph's ballot around to everybody, and you can mark your ballot the same way. If that were to happen, that probably would be illegal as a way to kind of create a certain amount of uniformity in balloting. Particularly, this is aimed at unsophisticated and uneducated communities that may have trouble kind of figuring out the whole ballot thing. So the selfie announcement that Mitch Morrissey came up with in Denver was tied to this statute that says you can't be showing other people your ballot. I don't know any prosecutor who would actually prosecute that, and I can't imagine a jury actually returning a conviction based on that because it just doesn't seem like it should be illegal. Apparently, what I've been told, the backstory was that within his office, he had a number of staff members who were passing around selfies about their ballots, and he was put off by that, so he did the announcement that you could be prosecuted, which, so.
So it sounds like we could get away with that here.
Yeah, you'd be okay. Yeah.
Just one second. Could you comment on what you believe the constitutionality or lack thereof about that law is?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. If it is, it would depend on how it came up in a case. If it was presented as merely kind of an administrative statute to protect the secret ballot, it would probably be found constitutional. On the other hand, people have the right to pretty much do whatever the hell they want on the internet with their cell phones and otherwise. And if it's seen as a way of limiting free expression, then it would be unconstitutional.
Spoken like a true politician. Brian.
Well, so far it's been found unconstitutional in other states, according to the Federal Appeals Court and some other courts. And I guess it seems as though, according to strict scrutiny, it should be obviously unconstitutional because there are existing laws against vote buying and selling and against voter coercion. And so it seems as though any negative use of a ballot selfie, any problematic use of it, would be illegal according to those statutes also. So it seems it's an extra redundancy to make it illegal according to the speech, and so it's not.
No, I think that's probably right. I'll tell you, we have a related, and I agree with that. We have a related statute in Colorado, which clearly has constitutional problems, but it hasn't been raised yet. Which says it's illegal, it's a misdemeanor, to knowingly state something that is false about your opponent. And there's a case it's brewing down in Jefferson County, where a Democrat named Rachel Zenzinger is running against a Republican named Laura Woods. Laura Woods keeps putting out stuff claiming that Rachel Zenzinger misused public funds to go to China when she was on the Arvada City Council. Rachel claims she never went to China, she never used public funds. It's a complete lie. And that case has been presented to the Jeffco DA. We put together a little panel of bipartisan folks, and we turned it down for prosecution, in part because of the obvious First Amendment problems with trying to sort out what is objectively true or false in a political campaign.
Anybody else before I jump in? Go ahead. Greg.
On that law,
Uh-huh.
as actually I saw part of that law go through, or the actual law go through the process of the legislature and making a misdemeanor to lie in an election. And I had wondered, you know, our national candidates tell lies, and could, it seems unlikely, but could a prosecutor in Colorado, like say, sue Trump or something like that?
Yeah, you could. Yeah.
Are you willing to do that?
No. You know, when I first got elected, Vincent Bugliosi, who was the prosecutor that wrote Helter Skelter about the Manson murders, he wrote me a long letter wanting me to prosecute George W. Bush for murder in connection with the Iraq War, which I declined to do. But he laid, yeah, you could. I mean, the whole issue, the problem, and you probably saw that. I don't know if you watched, if you were working with a legislator when it came through the legislature, but the problem the legislature often has is an issue in the abstract sounds a whole lot more workable than an actual fact pattern. And so, of course, most people would say, of course you shouldn't be able to lie about your opponent. But then you get into the question of what is a lie. And it's one thing to say, my opponent has been convicted of, you know, sexual assault on a child, when in fact they never have. That's the kind of lie I think they're talking about there. But when you're getting into vaguer issues about the meaning of a vote, et cetera, that's a very difficult thing to prove. So most prosecutors are going to stay a mile away from that stuff.
Anybody else? Okay, can't remember your question.
No.
Then I have a bunch of other questions. Let me just bring this up. The last issue. That's term limits for the DA, and who pushed that? Was that you?
I asked, yeah, push. What do you mean by push?
Did you ask for that?
I did. I asked the commissioners to put it on the ballot.
Okay.
And actually, in reaction to my staff, who asked me to ask the commissioners to put it on the ballot.
That's perfectly reasonable. Two more questions from me. Harkening back to marijuana, what's the politics behind why the county or city of Boulder is so, I guess, anti-marijuana stores or anti the free market in marijuana?
Well, that's a fair question. First of all, I think the county is not particularly relevant. I think the county has taken a relatively hands-off approach with most marijuana, but most marijuana retailers don't want to be. They want to sell in downtown Boulder. They don't want to be selling out in the frickin', you know, out in Gold Hill or something. I don't think, to be honest, as a longtime Boulderite and observer of city council and city government, I don't think that the city of Boulder is any more heavily regulatory of marijuana than they are of anything else. I think it's essentially it's a heavily regulated world in the city of Boulder, and they do it. Now, I will say, when marijuana was first legalized, and you know, it seems like a long time ago, but it was only 4 years ago. I think the city of Boulder really wanted it to work. They wanted to be an example of how you could have legalized marijuana in the community, and it would be okay. And a lot of the regulations came out of that. There's some debate on council now about trying to bring them more in line with state standards, and I think eventually that will happen.
My next question is, how have psychologically or the police for so many years were trained to arrest people for marijuana use and marijuana possessions. What's been the sociology of the change? How have they internalized this change?
Well, I think most of it's, I mean, police, it's interesting. Has anybody here ever been a police officer? Okay. My impression is that police, we don't get a lot of libertarian police officers, but
It's tough to.
yeah, I think the main thing that's happening is you're seeing the aging out of the longtime cops. You're seeing younger cops who have a more kind of modern approach and are used to it, and they don't remember. I mean, when I first got elected 8 years ago, and I'd never been the district attorney before, I'd been in private practice. I had a lot of cops coming in saying, if we're not arresting for marijuana, we're not going to be able to arrest, we won't be able to investigate crimes. What are we going to do? Well, it turned out it's okay. So I think cops are used to doing what they're told. I mean, cops come from an environment that is a command structure. They know that they answer to their commanders, and they also answer to the courts. And if the message of the courts is you can't do that, eventually they'll adapt to it. And I think they have in Boulder County by and large.
Scott.
I have another question on term limits. I ran for county coroner on the Libertarian ticket back in the early aughts, and my platform at that time was that the coroner should not be an elected position. And I'm aware historically of why political appointments were taken away and changed to ballot voting. But my question is, what I'm wondering is, what's special about you or the DA that you should have an exception to the term limits for elected offices?
That's a great question. And first of all, I think, and there's kind of two questions in there. First one is it beneficial to have an elected DA as opposed to appointed prosecutors as they have in some states? And generally, I think it is, because it requires me to get out in the community and meet with folks like you and hear what people care about, and it makes a huge difference in kind of how we prioritize. I think community, I've been working a lot in Latin America because for various reasons, I've learned Spanish, and I've been very involved in trying to help them address corruption. One of the problems with corruption in Latin America is prosecutors are almost always appointed. They don't answer to anybody, or they answer to another person. They don't answer to the community. So that's an issue. The major reason I put this on the ballot this year is I'm in the middle of trying to restructure a bunch of stuff in my office to put in place very different ways of prosecuting cases involving young adults and juveniles around restorative justice. This is a long-term process, and it's requiring me to get some funding from federal grants and state funding sources. And for me to go and do the negotiation for that, I need to be able to commit that I'm here for a long term. That's a major reason I did it for me. I think you should have term limits of some number. I think 4 is about right for a local office so that you can have people in long enough to make a difference, but you don't end up with Alex Hunter, my predecessor, who served as DA for 29 years. And in the last couple of terms, many people felt he was really not very present in the office. That's a problem with local issues. And coroner, I think, should be an appointed position.
Anybody else? Go ahead, Greg.
Yeah, about term limits. The public defender, Doug Wilson, often likes to tell the judiciary committees that the people in his office are young and inexperienced and underpaid. And the reason why they're young and inexperienced is because they're underpaid and they move on to other jobs, like in private practice. And I was wondering if extending term limits would give the prosecutors an unfair advantage over public defenders.
Well, no, because we are all, Doug Wilson, talking about a guy who has no term limits, and is a very powerful appointed public official. It's the state public defender, Doug Wilson, who earns a huge budget. He's able to pay his deputies much more than I'm able to pay them because I'm funded by local property tax. He's funded by state judicial. So no, I don't think it would, because we're so far behind anyway. And Doug knows it. I've talked to him about it a lot. The state judicial under the Democrats has really heavily funded the public defender's office. I don't think that's bad. I want to make sure we have good defense lawyers, but it's really been hard for us who are funded by local property taxes to keep up with that. I pay people right out of law school $57,000 a year to start, which is a fine starting salary for a young lawyer, although you can't pay off many student loans. The public defender, I think, starts people at like 72. People in poorer counties like Pueblo County, they start deputy DAs at something like $45,000 a year. So the public defender is doing fine, and Doug Wilson is going to be here for a long time, I'm sure. Yeah.
Go ahead, Charles.
Yeah, a question about legalization. Has this legalization brought about any conflicts between your office and federal agencies, and if so, can you describe it?
Yeah, the question is whether legalization has created conflicts between my office and federal authorities. It has on some issues, and some people have talked about me as a possible U.S. attorney at some point. It probably would cost me that position if anybody ever Because some of you may remember that back in 2011, the federal government announced, totally out of the blue, that they were going to be prosecuting any medical marijuana dispensaries within 1,000 feet of a school as Class 3 felonies. Well, the reality is Boulder and lots of other places had set up regulatory schemes that permitted most marijuana stores to be within 500 feet of a school if they met other zoning requirements. And I had a bit of a back and forth with the federal government on that at the time. Otherwise, the federal government, by and large, is interested in hard drugs. They're interested in terrorism. They're very involved in this bombing case we had up in Netherlands, which is you should read the articles on that. That's one of the most interesting little cases we've had in a while. And they don't seem to be very interested in marijuana.
I'm going to jump in here. It is now 10:16. We have 4 minutes left for our esteemed guest. One of the things we can do is say thank you to him for coming and Stan, we're going to pick up the unbelievably expensive cost of your lunch. So thank you so very much for coming.
Yeah.
Frank, you have one last question?
As I read in the newspaper, Netherlands sounded as a grudge, long-term grudge.
That's exactly what it was. It's a great little case. Go ahead.
And, okay, just as long as I'm up to speed with that.
Yeah, no, for all of you, anybody who's been here as long as I have, you may remember the STP family in the early 70s and the late 60s, which was kind of a radical, I just remember my mother always saying, these are not just hippies, Stanley. And a member of the STP family who was a particularly rambunctious guy named Deputy Dog was kicked out of a bar in 1971 and eventually shot in the back of the head by the sheriff of Netherlands. I mean, the marshal of Netherlands, a guy named Renner Forbes. He confessed to that in the 90s, was prosecuted and died like a month later. The guy that set the bomb up there 3 weeks ago set the bomb at the Netherlands police station because he was a member of the STP family as revenge for the killing of Deputy Dog in 1971. So it's a great, there's going to be a movie on this eventually. Billy Bob Thornton will be in it somewhere. Anyway, really, thanks for
Thank you
nice
so
to meet you,
much.
as always.
And we'll be seeing you shortly about the topic that we discussed.
Thank you, guys.
Okay.